Deep in the hollers of Appalachia, where ancient mountains hold secrets darker than the coal buried beneath them, there are stories that most people will never hear. If you're ready to uncover the twisted history and disturbing mysteries hidden in these hills, smash that subscribe button right now and hit the notification bell, because the content we explore on this channel isn't for the faint of heart. Welcome to Boring Nightmares, where we dive into the shadows of Appalachian folklore, true crime, and the strange phenomena that mainstream media won't touch. Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains themselves seem to watch and remember, certain family names have been whispered for over a century, not in admiration, but in fear. These weren't ordinary mountain families struggling to survive in the harsh Appalachian wilderness. These were dynasties built on blood, violence, and a willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. The Cornet family, the Ison family, and the French family created their own brutal kingdoms where justice came from the barrel of a gun and family honor was worth more than human life. In 1890, a Kentucky judge wrote in his private journal that he feared for his life every day he spent in Perry County. He wasn't afraid of wild animals or natural disasters. He was terrified of three families who had turned an entire region into their personal battlefield, where even cutting down a tree in your own yard could get you murdered in cold blood. These families didn't just participate in the infamous Appalachian feuds that captivated America in the late 1800s. They defined them. What you're about to learn isn't found in any mainstream history textbook. These stories were deliberately buried, just like many of the victims who dared to cross these deadly clans. The violence was so extreme, so calculated, and so deeply rooted in family tradition that even federal authorities struggled to comprehend what they were dealing with. We're talking about families who maintained private armies, conducted public executions, and created their own legal systems based entirely on blood revenge. Today, we're venturing into the darkest chapters of American history, where isolation and desperation created the perfect conditions for these family dynasties to flourish beyond the reach of law and order. From the strategic violence of the Cornet family to the calculated terror of Benjamin French's hired killers, to the explosive rage of Hobart Ison that shocked the nation in 1967, these three families represent different but equally devastating approaches to mountain warfare. The story begins in the earliest days of Appalachian settlement, around 1796, when William Cornet and others first ventured into what would become Perry County, Kentucky. These weren't just pioneers seeking a better life. They were founding families who would establish patterns of violence and control that would dominate the region for generations. The interconnected web of marriages, business relationships, and blood feuds they created would eventually explode into conflicts so brutal that they required military intervention to stop. The Cornet family's involvement in Appalachian violence stretches back to the very beginning of white settlement in eastern Kentucky. About the year 1796, William Cornet and Gideon Ison came from Virginia to Kentucky on a hunting expedition, as game had become scarce in their part of Virginia. This wasn't just a simple hunting trip. It was a reconnaissance for what would become one of the most significant family migrations in Appalachian history. These men were scouting territory that would become the foundation for family empires built on land, coal, and the willingness to kill anyone who threatened their interests. By 1800 or 1801, a larger party was organized in Scott County, Virginia, to make the permanent move to Kentucky. This group included Edward Callahan and his family, William Strong and his family, Daniel Davidson and his 3 sons with their families, and crucially, Roger and Robin Cornet. What made this migration particularly significant was how these families were interconnected through marriage. William Strong, Samuel Davidson, and the 2 Cornets had all married daughters of Edward Callahan. This wasn't coincidence. It was strategic family planning that created unbreakable bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation. When these families settled on the North Fork of the Kentucky River, at and near the mouth of Grapevine Creek in what is now Perry County, they weren't just establishing homesteads. They were creating the foundation for what would become known as the Eversole French feud, one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. The Cornet family's strategic marriages and land acquisitions positioned them as power brokers who could determine the outcome of life and death struggles in the isolated mountains. The most telling example of how the Cornet family operated came during the height of the French-Eversole feud. Robin Cornet, who had allied himself with the Eversole faction, eventually tried to withdraw from the conflict. He returned to his home, hoping to be done with the violence that was tearing the community apart. This decision would cost him his life and trigger a chain of events that would bring state military intervention to Perry County for the first time. In July 1890, Robin Cornet was ambushed and killed while performing the simple task of cutting a tree in the forest near his home. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. It was a calculated assassination designed to send a message that no one could simply walk away from the feud once they had chosen sides. The murder of Robin Cornet represents one of the most significant turning points in Appalachian feuding history because it was the final straw that convinced Judge Lilly that extraordinary measures were necessary to restore order. The response to Robin Cornet's murder was unprecedented in Kentucky legal history. Judge Lilly appeared with state troops for a special August court term in 1890 that would be held in a tent protected by armed soldiers. This became known as the Blanket Court because it operated under military protection rather than civilian authority. The fact that Robin Cornet's assassination while cutting a tree triggered this level of state intervention demonstrates how his death became a symbol of the complete breakdown of law and order in the region. What made Robin Cornet's murder particularly significant was that it illustrated the inescapable nature of Appalachian feuding. Here was a man who had attempted to withdraw from the conflict to return to his normal life as a farmer and family man. But in the world created by families like the Cornets, neutrality wasn't an option. Once you had chosen sides, once blood had been spilled, the only way out was through more violence. Robin Cornet's attempt to find peace cost him his life and demonstrated to everyone in Perry County that the feud had consumed the entire social structure of the region. The Cornet family's involvement in violence extended far beyond individual incidents to encompass a comprehensive system of control that shaped every aspect of life in their territory. Members of the Cornet family lived in the community of Pine Mountain since the very early years, and many were among the student body and workers at Pine Mountain Settlement School. This dual nature of their legacy, both violent and constructive, reflects the complex character of Appalachian families during this period. They weren't simply criminals or outlaws, they were community leaders who used violence as a tool of governance and social control. The transformation of some feuding leaders into constructive community members illustrates an important aspect of Appalachian culture that outsiders often missed. John Gilbert, who led the South Forkers in the Battle of Hanging Rock, later became a preacher, as did William Strong, who had led the North Forkers. This pattern of violent men finding redemption through religion was common in Appalachian communities, where the same cultural forces that produced deadly feudists also created powerful traditions of spiritual transformation and community building. But it was the Cornet family's strategic position in the economic and political networks of eastern Kentucky that made them truly dangerous. They weren't just mountain farmers who occasionally resorted to violence. They were sophisticated political operators who understood how to use family connections, marriage alliances, and calculated intimidation to control vast territories and resources. Their involvement in the French-Eversole feud wasn't just about personal honor or family revenge. It was about maintaining their position in a complex web of economic and political relationships that determined who would control the region's emerging coal wealth. The French family's role in Appalachian violence represents a fundamentally different approach to mountain warfare, one that would have lasting implications for how conflicts were conducted in the region. Unlike the Cornets, who were deeply rooted in local communities and traditional mountain culture, the French family represented the intrusion of outside economic interests that would reshape Appalachian society in the late 19th century. Benjamin Fulton French, the patriarch of the family's involvement in eastern Kentucky violence, was not a native mountaineer. He hailed from Tennessee but married Susan Lewis, a Kentuckian who connected him through marriage to influential families in Breathitt, Leslie, and other counties. This marriage wasn't just a romantic union. It was a strategic alliance that gave French access to the complex kinship networks that governed Appalachian society. However, his status as an outsider would prove to be both an advantage and a fatal weakness in the conflicts that followed. The French-Eversole feud, which raged primarily from 1887 to 1894, was more than just a family dispute. It was a conflict between two fundamentally different visions of what Appalachian society should become. Joseph C. Eversole represented the traditional mountain way of life, where local merchants maintained loyalty to their communities and protected local interests against outside exploitation. Benjamin French represented the new industrial order, where coal companies and outside investors sought to extract the region's mineral wealth at the lowest possible cost, regardless of the impact on local communities. After the Civil War, companies began buying huge amounts of land in the Appalachians to obtain rights to coal deposits underneath the mountains. French worked for one of these companies, buying coal rights from illiterate farmers, while Eversole was a local merchant who had loyalty to many of the area's longtime residents, most of whom he was related to. French was intent on buying the land at the lowest possible price for the large companies he represented. Eversole saw this practice as cheating illiterate farmers and began traveling the county to warn people that Fulton French was going to try to cheat them with unfair prices for coal rights. This conflict over coal rights wasn't just an economic dispute, it was a cultural war between traditional Appalachian values of community loyalty and mutual aid, and the emerging capitalist system that prioritized profit over people. French, as a non-native, had no emotional connection to the mountain people of eastern Kentucky. He saw them as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited. Eversole saw them as family, neighbors, and community members who deserved protection from outside predators. The resentment between the two sides grew until they eventually raised their armies, with French reportedly paying $2 to $2.50 a day to his hired guns. This represented a significant departure from traditional feuding practices, which typically involved family members and close allies fighting for honors and revenge. French's willingness to pay professional killers transformed the conflict from a family feud into something approaching commercial warfare, where violence became a business expense rather than a searcher of personal honors. Ambush became the favored tactic of this feud rather than standard warfare. It was safer for the concealed perpetrators, and responsibility for the attacks was more difficult to determine. Many people lived justifiably in fear. The atmosphere of terror created by French's tactics extended far beyond the immediate participants in the feud, affecting entire communities and establishing a precedent for using violence as a tool of economic control that would characterize industrial conflicts in Appalachia for decades to come. The French-Eversole feud stands among the most notorious conflicts in Appalachian history, earning its place alongside the legendary Hatfield and McCoy feud in terms of violence and cultural impact. Based on a report by General Sam Hill to Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, the feud killed more than 20 men, though other historians have estimated the death toll as high as 74. The conflict became a media sensation and was covered extensively by newspapers across America, with the first report appearing in the Louisville Courier-Journal on June 30th, 1886. The extensive media coverage of the French-Eversole feud helped shape national perceptions of Appalachian violence and contributed to lasting stereotypes about mountain people. The conflict represented everything that urban Americans found both fascinating and terrifying about the mountain regions. The combination of primitive violence with modern economic interests, the breakdown of law and order, and the apparent willingness of entire communities to engage in warfare over seemingly trivial disputes. What made the French family's approach to violence particularly disturbing was how it combined traditional feuding practices with modern business methods. French's use of hired assassins represented the commodification of violence, where killing became a professional service rather than a matter of family honor. This transformation would have lasting implications for Appalachian society, as it demonstrated how outside economic interests could corrupt and exploit traditional cultural practices for their own benefit. The first death attributed to the feud was one of French's friends, Silas Gayhart, who was ambushed and killed by a dozen men. While the Eversoles denied responsibility, and many believed Gayhart's death resulted from a different dispute, French blamed the Eversole clan and used it as justification for escalating the conflict. This pattern of using questionable incidents to justify retaliation would characterize much of the violence that followed. The strategic nature of the French-Eversole conflict, with its tactical withdrawals and urban warfare conducted in the streets of Hazard, demonstrated how sophisticated these family armies had become. When French finally re-entered the town in June 1887 after gathering more men, Eversole was waiting for him. The two ships engaged in a shootout in the middle of town that lasted an entire day, with only one of French's men being wounded. This wasn't the spontaneous violence of traditional feuding. It was calculated warfare conducted by organized military units. The French family's legacy extends beyond the immediate violence of their feud to encompass broader questions about economic development, cultural preservation, and the role of outsiders in Appalachian communities. Their willingness to engage in prolonged warfare over economic interests established a template for industrial violence that would characterize Appalachian conflicts well into the 20th century, as coal companies and labor unions continued to battle over control of the region's natural resources and economic future. The Ison family's approach to dealing with outside interference represents yet another dimension of Appalachian family violence, one that demonstrates how the legacy of feuding and resistance to external authority continued to influence mountain communities well into the modern era. The transformation from traditional feuding to professional violence marked a critical evolution in Appalachian family warfare, and nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of hired killers like Thomas Bad Tom Smith. Smith represented something entirely new in mountain culture, a man who killed not for family honor or personal vendettas, but for cold, calculated profit. His emergence as the French family's primary assassin signaled the corruption of traditional mountain values by outside industrial interests and easy money. Thomas Smith earned his notorious nickname through a combination of criminal cunning and ruthless efficiency that made him invaluable to wealthy feuding families willing to pay for results. Unlike traditional feudists who fought openly and accepted the risks of face-to-face combat, Smith perfected the art of ambush killing, striking from concealment and disappearing before his victims could mount any defense. His methods were particularly suited to the mountainous terrain of eastern Kentucky, where dense forests and winding hollows provided perfect cover for assassination. Smith's criminal career began early, with theft and petty violence marking his youth, before he discovered that his willingness to kill could generate substantial income. By his 20th birthday, he had already participated in Election Day violence in Hazard, the county seat of Perry County, where political disputes often erupted into gunfights that claimed multiple lives. These early experiences taught him that violence could be both profitable and largely consequence-free in a region where law enforcement was weak and corrupt officials could be easily bought. The French family's recruitment of Bad Tom Smith represented their adaptation to the changing nature of Appalachian conflict, as traditional family-based feuding gave way to more sophisticated and deadly forms of warfare. Benjamin Fulton French, as an outsider with no deep roots in mountain culture, felt no obligation to follow the unwritten rules that had traditionally governed family feuds. His willingness to hire professional killers like Smith gave him a significant advantage over opponents like Joseph Eversole, who initially relied on family members and loyal supporters rather than paid assassins. Smith's most infamous murders occurred in 1888, when he and 3 Confederates ambushed Joe Eversole and Nicholas Combs along a mountain road. The calculated nature of this attack demonstrated the evolution of feuding tactics from spontaneous violence to carefully planned assassination campaigns. Smith and his associates positioned themselves in thick brush alongside the trail, waiting for their targets to approach before opening fire with multiple weapons. The volume of gunfire was so intense that both victims were struck multiple times before they could react or attempt to escape. The murder of Nicholas Combs revealed the depth of Smith's depravity and his complete abandonment of traditional mountain codes of honor. Combs, a young man who had simply been riding with Eversole, was not a primary target, but became collateral damage in the ambush. After being wounded in the initial volley, Combs regained consciousness to find Smith rifling through the dead bodies for valuables. When the young man asked why he had been shot, Smith's response was to execute him with a bullet through the head, explaining coldly that he could not afford to leave living witnesses. This calculated execution of a wounded bystander marked a significant departure from traditional feuding practices, where combatants typically showed mercy to non-participants and avoided killing unless absolutely necessary for family honor. Smith's willingness to murder an innocent young man simply to eliminate a potential witness demonstrated how professional violence had corrupted the cultural foundations of Appalachian conflict, replacing honor-based warfare with mercenary brutality. The robbery of murder victims represented another degradation of feuding traditions that had previously been governed by concepts of honor and justice rather than simple criminal opportunism. Traditional feudists killed to defend family reputation or avenge perceived wrongs, not to enrich themselves through theft. Smith's practice of looting his victims' bodies transformed political assassination into common highway robbery, further corrupting the cultural meaning of mountain violence. Smith's relationship with the French family illustrated the complex dynamics between wealthy feuding sponsors and their hired killers. While Benjamin French provided Smith with money, clothing, and other necessities, he maintained plausible deniability regarding specific murders by avoiding direct orders or explicit contracts. This arrangement allowed French to benefit from Smith's violence while protecting himself from legal consequences, demonstrating the sophisticated nature of professional feuding operations. The network of support that enabled Smith's criminal career extended far beyond his immediate relationship with the French family to include corrupt officials, sympathetic merchants, and intimidated witnesses who feared retaliation if they cooperated with law enforcement. This infrastructure of corruption and fear allowed professional killers, like Smith, to operate with virtual impunity for years, accumulating body counts that would have been impossible without systematic protection from local authorities. Smith's eventual capture and trial represented the state's belated attempt to restore law and order to feuding regions that had been dominated by private violence for decades. His 1895 execution in Breathitt County drew an estimated 20,000 spectators, making it one of the largest public gatherings in Kentucky history up to that point. The massive attendance reflected both morbid curiosity about the notorious killer and genuine relief that his reign of terror had finally ended. The religious conversion that Smith claimed to experience on the day of his execution added a complex dimension to his legacy, as mountain culture had always maintained an uneasy relationship between violence and redemption. His baptism and public confession before being hanged reflected traditional beliefs about the possibility of salvation even for the most hardened criminals, while also providing him with a final opportunity to implicate other participants in the French-Eversole feud. Smith's deathbed confession revealed the extent of the conspiracy surrounding the French-Eversole conflict, naming specific individuals and describing murder plots that had previously been matters of speculation and rumor. His testimony implicated prominent community members in assassination schemes, while also exposing the systematic nature of feuding violence that had claimed dozens of lives over nearly a decade of warfare. The transformation of Bad Tom Smith from local thief to professional assassin illustrated broader changes occurring throughout Appalachian society as traditional mountain culture encountered industrial capitalism and outside exploitation. The availability of easy money from feuding families created opportunities for men like Smith to profit from violence in ways that had been impossible in the subsistence economy that had previously characterized mountain life. Smith's story also demonstrated how the breakdown of traditional social structures could create space for individuals who operated entirely outside community norms and values. Unlike traditional feudists who maintained reputations within their communities and were bound by cultural expectations, professional killers like Smith existed on the margins of society, accountable only to their paymasters and their own survival instincts. The legacy of professional violence, introduced by men like Bad Tom Smith, extended far beyond the immediate casualties of the French-Eversole feud to influence patterns of conflict resolution throughout Appalachian communities. The success of hired killers in achieving their sponsors' objectives encouraged other wealthy families to adopt similar tactics, leading to an arms race of escalating violence that made traditional feuding seem almost civilized by comparison. The psychological impact of professional killers on Appalachian communities cannot be overstated, as their presence transformed the social landscape from one where violence followed predictable patterns based on family relationships and cultural codes to one where death could strike anyone at any time for purely economic reasons. This atmosphere of unpredictable terror fundamentally altered how mountain families approached conflict resolution and community relationships. The evolution from family-based feuding to professional violence also reflected broader changes in American society during the late 19th century, as industrial capitalism created new forms of economic competition and social organization that challenged traditional community structures. The French-Eversole feud represented a collision between these emerging capitalist values and older mountain traditions, with deadly consequences for all involved. The role of professional killers like Bad Tom Smith in Appalachian feuding ultimately hastened the intervention of state and federal authorities who recognized that traditional law enforcement methods were inadequate to address the level of violence and corruption that characterized these conflicts. The systematic nature of professional feuding operations required equally systematic responses from government agencies, leading to the militarization of law enforcement in feuding regions. The story of Bad Tom Smith and the professionalization of Appalachian violence serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of weak institutions and economic exploitation in isolated communities. When legitimate authority fails to provide justice and protection, violent entrepreneurs will inevitably emerge to fill the vacuum, creating cycles of escalating brutality that can persist for generations. The transformation of mountain feuding from honor-based family conflicts to profit-driven assassination campaigns represented a fundamental corruption of Appalachian culture that had lasting consequences for the region's development and reputation. The image of professional killers, like Bad Tom Smith, became permanently associated with Appalachian violence in the national imagination, contributing to stereotypes that persist to this day. Understanding the role of professional violence in Appalachian feuding provides crucial insight into how economic pressures and cultural change can interact to produce devastating social consequences. Now let's examine the professional killers who transformed Appalachian feuding from family honor disputes into calculated business enterprises. The emergence of men like Thomas Bad Tom Smith represents a dark evolution in mountain warfare, where violence became a commodity traded for coin rather than blood vengeance. Thomas Smith earned his fearsome nickname through methodical brutality that went far beyond traditional feuding practices. Unlike the Cornets, who fought for family honor, or the French who battled for economic control, Bad Tom killed for money with the cold efficiency of a businessman collecting debts. His criminal career began in childhood with petty theft, progressing through his teenage years to armed robbery and assault. By age 20, he had already participated in his first gun battle during a heated election day confrontation in Hazard, the county seat of Perry County. What distinguished Bad Tom from other mountain fighters was his complete lack of loyalty to any family or cause beyond his own profit. He possessed no land holdings, maintained no family ties, and showed no allegiance to community traditions that typically governed Appalachian conflicts. This rootlessness made him the perfect weapon for wealthy feuding families who needed violence conducted without the complicated web of kinship obligations that usually accompanied mountain warfare. Benjamin Fulton French recognized Bad Tom's potential early in their relationship, understanding that hiring professional killers provided significant advantages over relying on family members and traditional allies. Professional assassins like Smith could be deployed without creating additional blood feuds, as their victims' families had no clear target for revenge beyond the hired gun himself. This strategy allowed wealthy families to conduct warfare while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding the generational cycles of vengeance that typically characterized Appalachian conflicts. Bad Tom's methods reflected his mercenary approach to violence, rather than engaging in the face-to-face confrontations that mountain honor codes typically demanded. He specialized in ambushes and surprise attacks that maximized his survival chances while ensuring his targets had no opportunity to defend themselves. His preferred tactic involved studying his victims' routines for weeks, identifying moments of maximum vulnerability, then striking with overwhelming force before disappearing into the mountain wilderness he knew intimately. The transformation of Appalachian violence from honor-based conflicts to commercial enterprises fundamentally changed the nature of mountain warfare. Traditional feuding operated according to established rules and customs that, while brutal, provided some measure of predictability and limitation. Professional killers like Bad Tom recognized no such constraints, viewing violence purely as a business transaction where efficiency and profit mattered more than honor or tradition. Smith's most notorious crime demonstrated the calculating nature of professional mountain violence. In 1888, he and three Confederates ambushed Joe Eversole and Nicholas Combs on a remote mountain road, shooting both men from concealment in thick brush. After confirming that Eversole was dead, Smith began robbing the body while Combs, though mortally wounded, regained consciousness and asked why they had been shot. Rather than showing mercy or even ignoring the dying man, Smith coldly executed Combs with a bullet through the temples, stating that he could not afford to leave living witnesses. This execution reveals the purely business-minded approach that professional killers brought to Appalachian violence. Traditional mountain fighters might have spared a mortally wounded enemy out of respect or mercy, but Bad Tom viewed Combs purely as a potential threat to his future earning capacity. The robbery of Eversole's corpse further demonstrates how professional violence corrupted traditional feuding practices, as taking money from the dead violated mountain honor codes that even the most brutal family conflicts typically respected. The French family's employment of professional killers represented a broader pattern of industrial interests corrupting traditional Appalachian society. Just as coal companies hired outside workers to extract resources while offering nothing to local communities, wealthy feuding families began importing violent specialists who had no connection to the cultural traditions that had previously governed mountain conflicts. This industrialization of violence created a new class of rootless killers who moved between conflicts like migrant workers, selling their services to whoever offered the highest payment. Bad Tom's network of criminal associates reveals how professional violence created its own economy within Appalachian communities. He maintained relationships with other hired killers, corrupt officials, and criminal entrepreneurs who provided weapons, information, and safe houses in exchange for money or favors. This shadow economy operated parallel to legitimate mountain society, offering opportunities for profit that traditional subsistence farming and small-scale commerce could not match. The psychological profile of professional killers, like Bad Tom, differed dramatically from traditional feuding participants. While family-based violence typically involved men fighting to protect their honor, land, or kinfolk, professional killers were motivated purely by material gain and personal survival. This lack of emotional investment in the conflicts they participated in made them both more dangerous and more unpredictable, as they felt no loyalty to their employers beyond the duration of their contracts. Smith's ability to evade capture for years, despite committing multiple murders in a relatively small geographic area, demonstrates how professional killers exploited weaknesses in local law enforcement. His intimate knowledge of mountain terrain, combined with his network of criminal contacts and corrupt officials, allowed him to disappear after each killing and resurface when new opportunities for profit arose. Local sheriffs and constables, often related to feuding families or simply outgunned by professional killers, frequently chose to avoid confrontation rather than risk their lives pursuing dangerous criminals. The economic disruption caused by professional killers extended far beyond their immediate victims. Bad Tom's reign of terror created an atmosphere of fear that affected commerce, travel, and daily life throughout Perry County. Merchants hesitated to transport goods through areas where professional killers operated. Farmers avoided markets where ambushes might occur, and families lived in constant anxiety about becoming collateral damage in conflicts they had no connection to. The transformation of Bad Tom from criminal to celebrity reveals how professional violence became entertainment for audiences far removed from its immediate consequences. Newspapers across the country covered his exploits with sensational headlines and detailed descriptions that romanticized his brutality while ignoring the suffering of his victims and their families. This media attention created a perverse incentive system where professional killers gained fame and notoriety that could be converted into future earning opportunities. Bad Tom's final capture and execution marked a turning point in the state's approach to professional violence in Appalachian communities. His arrest came only after he made the mistake of killing Joe Eversole and Nicholas Combs in a manner so brutal that it finally prompted sustained law enforcement action. The fact that he had committed at least 7 murders before authorities seriously pursued him demonstrates how professional killers had been allowed to operate with virtual impunity for years. The massive public attendance at Smith's execution, with an estimated 20,000 spectators, reveals the complex relationship between Appalachian communities and professional violence. While many attendees came to celebrate the end of Bad Tom's reign of terror, others were drawn by morbid curiosity about a man who had become a legendary figure in mountain folklore. The execution became a form of public entertainment that both condemned and celebrated the violence that had plagued the region for years. Bad Tom's last-minute religious conversion and baptism on the day of his execution reflects the complicated relationship between violence and redemption in Appalachian culture. His public confession and apparent repentance satisfied some community members who believed in the possibility of spiritual transformation, while others viewed his conversion as a calculated attempt to avoid divine punishment rather than genuine remorse for his crimes. The detailed confession Smith provided before his execution revealed the extent of the conspiracy surrounding the French-Eversole feud and implicated prominent community members in murder plots. His testimony exposed how professional killers served as the violent instruments of wealthy families who preferred to keep their hands clean while pursuing their economic and political objectives through intimidation and assassination. Smith's admission that Benjamin French had never formally hired him, but had provided clothes, money, and other support whenever requested, illustrates the informal nature of professional violence relationships. This arrangement allowed wealthy feuding families to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring they had access to deadly force when needed. The lack of explicit contracts or formal agreements made prosecution difficult and allowed the true architects of violence to escape justice while their hired killers faced execution. The impact of professional killers like Bad Tom Smith extended far beyond their immediate crimes to fundamentally alter the nature of social relationships in Appalachian communities. Their presence introduced an element of unpredictability and terror that traditional feuding, while brutal, had not possessed. Professional killers recognized no family loyalties, honored no traditional codes of conduct, and showed no mercy to non-combatants, creating an atmosphere of fear that affected entire communities. The legacy of professional violence in Appalachian feuding established patterns that would continue to influence the region's relationship with organized crime well into the 20th century. The success of hired killers like Bad Tom Smith demonstrated that violence could be a profitable career for those willing to abandon traditional moral constraints, creating a template that would later be adopted by bootleggers, drug traffickers, and other criminal enterprises that sought to control Appalachian communities through fear and intimidation. The emergence of professional killers also marked the beginning of the end for traditional Appalachian feuding, as their involvement stripped away the cultural and social elements that had previously given meaning to family-based violence. When conflicts became purely commercial enterprises conducted by hired specialists, they lost the community support and cultural legitimacy that had previously allowed them to persist for generations. The winter of 1889 brought more than just bitter cold to the Kentucky mountains. It brought Thomas Bad Tom Smith's a final reckoning. As he stood on the scaffold in Jackson Breathitt County, with over 20,000 spectators gathered below, Smith represented something far more sinister than a simple mountain feudist. He was the embodiment of how Appalachian family violence had evolved from honor-based conflicts into a calculated business of death. Bad Tom Smith's execution marked the end of an era, but not the end of the violence. The professional killers he represented had fundamentally changed the nature of Appalachian feuding. No longer were these conflicts solely about family honor or personal vendettas. They had become enterprises where death was a commodity and loyalty could be purchased with a daily wage of $2.50. The French family's willingness to hire assassins like Smith demonstrated how outside economic interests had corrupted traditional mountain justice, introducing a mercenary element that made conflicts exponentially more deadly and unpredictable. The transformation from family-based feuding to professional violence created a template that would influence organized crime in Appalachia for generations to come. Smith's cold-blooded execution of Nicholas Combs, shooting the wounded boy through the temples simply because he couldn't afford to leave witnesses, illustrated the calculating brutality that separated hired killers from traditional feudists. Where mountain families had once fought for honor, respect, and protection of their kinfolk, professional assassins like Smith fought only for money, treating murder as just another job to be completed efficiently and without emotion. The emergence of hired guns fundamentally altered the social fabric of Appalachian communities. Traditional feuding, while violent, operated within understood cultural boundaries. Families fought other families, but there were unwritten rules about targets, methods, and acceptable levels of violence. Professional killers recognized no such boundaries. They would kill anyone for the right price, target women and children if necessary, and employ methods that traditional mountain culture considered dishonorable. This shift from honor-based violence to profit-driven killing marked the beginning of Appalachia's transformation from a region governed by family loyalty to one increasingly controlled by criminal enterprises. Bad Tom Smith's confession on the scaffold revealed the extensive network of corruption that enabled professional violence to flourish in the mountains. His admission that Benjamin French had provided him with clothes, money, and support whenever requested demonstrated how wealthy families like the French had created patron-client relationships with criminals. These relationships extended far beyond simple employment, creating networks of dependency that bound killers to their benefactors through ongoing financial obligations and mutual criminality. Smith's revelation that he had been present when French, Boone Fraser, and Joe Adkins plotted the murder of Judge Josiah Combs exposed how deeply professional violence had penetrated the region's political and legal institutions. The corruption revealed by Smith's confession illustrated how hired killers served not just as assassins, but as intelligence gatherers and intimidation specialists for their wealthy patrons. Professional killers maintained extensive networks of informants, monitored the movements of potential targets, and gathered compromising information that could be used for blackmail or political leverage. This intelligence gathering capability made them invaluable to families like the French, who were engaged in complex economic and political conflicts that required detailed knowledge of their enemies' activities and vulnerabilities. The weapons and tactics employed by professional killers represented a significant departure from traditional mountain warfare. While family feudists typically used rifles and shotguns in face-to-face confrontations or relatively straightforward ambushes, hired assassins like Smith employed more sophisticated methods. They used specialized weapons, created elaborate traps, and developed techniques for disposing of evidence that reflected a professional approach to murder. Smith's preference for the 1904 Smith & Wesson revolver, his systematic robbery of victims, and his careful elimination of witnesses demonstrated a level of planning and execution that went far beyond the passionate violence typical of family feuds. The psychological profile of professional killers differed markedly from traditional feudists. Family members who engaged in feuding violence were typically motivated by concepts of honor, loyalty, and revenge that were deeply embedded in mountain culture. They fought to protect their families, avenge wrongs, and maintain their reputation within their communities. Professional killers like Smith, however, were motivated primarily by financial gain and personal advantage. They felt no particular loyalty to their employers beyond the duration of their contracts, harbored no personal animosity toward their victims, and viewed violence as simply a means of earning a living. This psychological difference had profound implications for the nature of violence in Appalachian communities. Traditional feudists, despite their willingness to kill, maintained certain human connections and moral boundaries that limited their actions. They typically avoided harming innocent bystanders, showed mercy to defeated enemies, and eventually sought reconciliation when honor had been satisfied. Professional killers recognized no such limitations. They would kill anyone who interfered with their objectives, showed no mercy to wounded opponents, and viewed every conflict as a zero-sum game where only complete victory was acceptable. The recruitment and training of professional killers created a new criminal class in Appalachian society. Wealthy families like the French actively sought out men who had been marginalized by economic changes, displaced by industrial development, or corrupted by alcohol and gambling. These recruits were typically young men under 40 who had been pushed away from traditional occupations like farming and logging by the region's economic transformation. Having lost their place in legitimate society, they were vulnerable to offers of steady income and social status within criminal organizations. The training process for professional killers involved both practical instruction in weapons and tactics and psychological conditioning to overcome natural inhibitions against killing. Recruits learned advanced marksmanship, tracking techniques, and methods for planning and executing ambushes. More importantly, they were gradually desensitized to violence through exposure to increasingly brutal acts and indoctrinated with beliefs that justified their actions. They were taught to view their victims as enemies of their patrons, threats to their own survival, or simply obstacles to be removed rather than as human beings deserving of moral consideration. The impact of professional violence on Appalachian communities extended far beyond the immediate victims of assassinations. The presence of hired killers created an atmosphere of terror that paralyzed normal social and economic activity. Merchants hesitated to travel mountain roads, farmers avoided isolated fields, and families lived in constant fear of sudden attacks. This climate of fear gave criminal organizations tremendous power over entire communities, allowing them to control economic activity, influence political decisions, and suppress opposition through intimidation rather than direct violence. The corruption of local institutions by professional killers and their employers represented one of the most damaging aspects of this criminal evolution. Hired assassins and their patrons systematically infiltrated law enforcement agencies, judicial systems, and political organizations through bribery, intimidation, and blackmail. They placed informants in sheriff's departments, corrupted judges and prosecutors, and influenced elections through voter intimidation and fraud. This institutional corruption created a vicious cycle where criminal organizations became increasingly powerful while legitimate authorities became increasingly ineffective. The economic foundations of professional violence created sustainable criminal enterprises that could survive the deaths of individual leaders and adapt to changing circumstances. Unlike traditional feuds, which typically ended when key family members were killed or when honor was satisfied, criminal organizations built around hired killers developed institutional structures that could continue operating across generations. They created hierarchies of command, systems for recruiting and training new members, and methods for generating revenue that did not depend on the presence of any single individual. The financial resources required to maintain professional killers came from a variety of criminal and semi-criminal enterprises. Coal companies like those represented by Benjamin French used hired killers to intimidate competitors, suppress labor organizing, and eliminate obstacles to their expansion. Moonshine operations employed assassins to protect their territories and eliminate rival producers. Gambling enterprises used killers to collect debts and maintain order in their establishments. Political organizations hired assassins to eliminate opponents and intimidate voters. The legacy of professional violence in Appalachian family conflicts extended far beyond the immediate period of the Great Feuds. The methods, organizational structures, and cultural attitudes developed by hired killers like Bad Tom Smith provided templates for later criminal enterprises throughout the region. The bootlegging operations of the Prohibition era, the organized crime syndicates of the mid-20th century, and the drug trafficking organizations of recent decades all drew upon techniques and traditions established by the professional killers of the feuding period. The transformation of Appalachian violence from family-based feuding to professional killing also had profound implications for how the region was perceived by the outside world. Traditional feuds, while violent could be understood within cultural frameworks that emphasized honor, loyalty, and family solidarity. Professional violence, however, appeared to outside observers as simple criminality motivated by greed and brutality. This perception contributed to lasting stereotypes about Appalachian people and culture that portrayed the region as inherently violent and morally corrupt. The eventual suppression of professional killers, like Bad Tom Smith, required unprecedented cooperation between state and federal authorities. Traditional law enforcement methods proved inadequate against criminal organizations that employed sophisticated intelligence networks, corrupted local officials, and operated across state boundaries. The successful prosecution of Smith and his associates required special courts protected by military forces, the transfer of cases to distant jurisdictions, and the deployment of resources typically reserved for major military operations. The execution of Bad Tom Smith on that cold day in 1895 symbolized the state's determination to restore legitimate authority in the Appalachian Mountains. The massive crowd that gathered to witness his death demonstrated the public's fascination with the violent conflicts that had torn apart their communities for over a decade. Smith's last-minute conversion and baptism reflected the complex relationship between violence and redemption that characterized mountain culture, where even the most hardened criminals might seek spiritual salvation in their final moments. Yet Smith's death did not mark the end of professional violence in Appalachia. The criminal enterprises he represented had become too deeply embedded in the region's economic and social structures to be eliminated by the execution of individual killers. The techniques he pioneered, the networks he helped establish, and the cultural changes he embodied continued to influence Appalachian violence for generations to come. The legacy of professional violence in Appalachian feuding created a dangerous precedent that extended far beyond individual conflicts. When families like the French began paying killers like Bad Tom Smith $2.50 a day, they transformed feuding from a matter of family honor into a business enterprise. This commercialization of violence attracted rootless men who had been displaced by the economic upheaval that accompanied industrialization in the mountains. These professional killers brought military-style tactics and cold calculation to conflicts that had previously been governed by codes of honor and family loyalty. The systematic nature of this violence became evident in the methods employed by hired assassins. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation, which had characterized earlier feuding, professional killers specialized in ambush tactics that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their risk. They studied their targets' routines, identified vulnerable locations, and struck with precision that reflected their experience in warfare and criminal activity. The murder of Joe Eversole and Nicholas Combs exemplified this calculated approach, as Bad Tom Smith and his Confederates positioned themselves along a known travel route and executed their victims with military efficiency. What made professional violence particularly dangerous was its expansion beyond traditional feuding boundaries. While family-based conflicts typically remained contained within specific communities and involved clearly defined participants, hired killers operated across county and state lines. They brought violence to areas that had previously been considered safe, as their lack of local connections freed them from the social constraints that had historically limited feuding activities. This geographic expansion of violence created a climate of fear that extended throughout the Appalachian region, as no community could be certain it was beyond the reach of feuding families and their hired armies. The economic incentives that drove professional violence also corrupted local institutions in ways that traditional feuding had never achieved. Wealthy families, thus like the French, used their resources not only to hire killers, but also to purchase protection from law enforcement officials as judges and politicians. This systematic corruption created networks of complicity that made it virtually impossible for legitimate authorities to address feuding violence effectively. County sheriffs found themselves outgunned and outnumbered by private armies, while judges discovered that their courtrooms had become targets for assassination rather than venues for justice. The psychological impact of professional violence on Appalachian communities proved devastating and long-lasting. Traditional feuding, despite its brutality, had operated within understood parameters of honor and revenge that provided some predictability to conflicts. Professional killers introduced an element of randomness and terror that destroyed the social fabric of mountain communities. Neighbors could no longer trust one another, as anyone might be an informant or hired assassin. The bonds of kinship and community loyalty that had historically provided stability in isolated mountain settlements began to break down under the pressure of commercialized violence. The French family's use of hired killers also demonstrated how outside economic interests could manipulate local conflicts for their own purposes. Benjamin French's role as an agent for coal companies reveals how industrial exploitation created conditions that made professional violence profitable and sustainable. By pitting local families against one another through hired assassins, outside interests could acquire valuable resources at minimal cost while avoiding direct responsibility for the resulting bloodshed. This pattern of using local violence to advance external economic interests would become a recurring theme in Appalachian history. The transformation of feuding into professional violence also changed the nature of conflict resolution in mountain communities. Traditional feuding had typically ended through negotiated settlements, intermarriage between feuding families, or the exhaustion of combatants. Professional violence created conflicts that could only be resolved through the complete destruction of one side or massive intervention by state authorities. The economic incentives that sustained hired killers meant that violence would continue as long as someone was willing to pay for it, regardless of the original causes of conflict. Bad Tom Smith's eventual capture and execution revealed both the limitations and the effectiveness of professional violence in Appalachian feuding. His ability to evade justice for 7 murders demonstrated how hired killers could operate with virtual impunity when protected by wealthy patrons and corrupt officials. However, his final confession also showed how the commercialization of violence created vulnerabilities that traditional feuding had not possessed. Professional killers lacked the family loyalty and community support that had historically protected feuding participants, making them more susceptible to betrayal and capture when their usefulness ended. The public spectacle surrounding Bad Tom Smith's execution attracted an estimated 20,000 spectators, revealing the complex relationship between Appalachian communities and professional violence. While many residents feared and resented hired killers, they also found themselves fascinated by the dramatic nature of commercialized feuding. The massive attendance at Smith's hanging reflected both a desire for justice and a morbid entertainment value that had transformed local conflicts into regional spectacles. This commodification of violence through public executions and newspaper coverage created additional economic incentives for continued feuding. The involvement of professional killers in Appalachian feuding also influenced the development of law enforcement practices throughout the region. State authorities were forced to develop new tactics and strategies to combat organized violence that operated across jurisdictional boundaries. The creation of special courts, the deployment of state militia forces, and the establishment of witness protection programs all emerged as responses to the challenges posed by professional feuding violence. These innovations in law enforcement would later prove valuable in addressing other forms of organized crime that emerged in the region. The French family's reliance on hired killers ultimately contributed to their downfall, as professional violence proved impossible to control once unleashed. Bad Tom Smith's willingness to implicate prominent community members in his final confession demonstrated how hired assassins could become liabilities for their employers. The lack of loyalty that made professional killers effective also made them unpredictable and dangerous to those who employed them. This inherent instability in relationships between feuding families and hired killers created additional sources of conflict and violence. The legacy of professional violence in Appalachian feuding extended well beyond the end of the traditional feuding period. The tactics, networks, and corruption that characterized hired killer operations provided templates for later criminal enterprises, including bootlegging operations during Prohibition and drug trafficking organizations in the modern era. The normalization of violence as a business strategy and the corruption of local institutions created conditions that would continue to influence Appalachian communities for generations. The role of media coverage in promoting and sustaining professional violence cannot be overlooked. Newspapers across America provided extensive coverage of feuding conflicts, often sensationalizing the activities of hired killers and creating celebrity status for notorious assassins like Bad Tom Smith. This media attention created additional economic incentives for violence, while also influencing public perceptions of Appalachian communities. The stereotype of mountain people as inherently violent and lawless was reinforced by dramatic accounts of professional feuding that emphasized brutality while ignoring the economic and social factors that made such violence profitable. The French-Eversole feud's transformation from a local dispute into a media sensation demonstrated how professional violence could become a form of entertainment for national audiences. The extensive newspaper coverage of hired killers and their activities created a market for sensational stories about Appalachian violence that would influence regional representations for decades. This commodification of local suffering through media coverage created additional layers of exploitation that compounded the damage caused by the original conflicts. The ultimate resolution of conflicts involving professional violence required unprecedented levels of state intervention that fundamentally changed the relationship between Appalachian communities and external authority. The deployment of military forces, the establishment of special courts, and the suspension of normal legal procedures all represented dramatic departures from traditional approaches to local conflict resolution. While these interventions successfully ended the most egregious examples of professional feuding violence, they also established precedents for federal involvement in local affairs that would continue to influence regional politics and social relationships. The economic disruption caused by professional violence extended far beyond the immediate costs of hiring killers and purchasing protection. The climate of fear and uncertainty created by hired assassins discouraged legitimate business investment and development in affected areas. Merchants, farmers, and craftsmen found it difficult to operate in environments where violence could erupt without warning and where legal protections were unreliable. This economic stagnation contributed to the poverty and isolation that would characterize many Appalachian communities well into the 20th century. The French family's use of professional violence also revealed how industrial development could destabilize traditional mountain society in ways that created opportunities for exploitation and conflict. The arrival of coal companies and their agents disrupted established social relationships and economic patterns while introducing new sources of wealth and power that existing institutions were unprepared to regulate. The legacy of professional killers, like Bad Tom Smith, fundamentally altered the nature of Appalachian conflict, transforming what had once been honor-based family disputes into calculated criminal enterprises that prioritized profit over principle. Smith's execution in 1895 marked more than the end of one man's killing spree. It represented the state's desperate attempt to reclaim authority over a region where violence had become so systematized that it threatened the very foundations of civilized society. The massive crowd of 20,000 who gathered to witness his hanging understood they were watching the conclusion of an era, though few realized that the methods Smith had perfected would continue to influence Appalachian violence for generations to come. The industrialization of feuding violence created a template that would be replicated throughout the region as economic pressures intensified and traditional social structures continued to deteriorate. Where once families like the Cornets had fought to protect their community's interests against outside exploitation, the emergence of professional killers introduced a mercenary element that divorced violence from its cultural moorings. The French family's willingness to pay daily wages to assassins demonstrated how easily traditional mountain values could be corrupted when sufficient economic incentives were introduced. This transformation from honor-based conflict to profit-driven violence marked a fundamental shift in Appalachian society, as families discovered that their isolation and the region's weak law enforcement created ideal conditions for criminal enterprise. The psychological impact of this transformation extended far beyond the immediate participants in feuding conflicts. Communities that had once understood violence as a regrettable but necessary response to threats against family honor now found themselves terrorized by killers who murdered for money rather than principle. The ambush tactics perfected by Smith and his contemporaries created an atmosphere of perpetual fear, as no one could predict when economic interests might make them targets for assassination. This random quality of professional violence broke down the traditional codes that had previously governed mountain conflicts, where certain boundaries were respected and specific rules of engagement were observed. When violence became purely transactional, these cultural restraints disappeared, leading to an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of attacks. The corruption of local institutions that accompanied the rise of professional violence created a self-perpetuating cycle of lawlessness that would plague Appalachian communities well into the 20th century. Families like the French discovered that the same economic leverage they used to hire killers could also be applied to purchase protection from law enforcement officials. Sheriffs, judges, and prosecutors found themselves facing the choice between accepting bribes or becoming targets for assassination, with many choosing the former option as the safer alternative. This systematic corruption of the justice system meant that professional killers operated with virtual impunity, knowing that their wealthy patrons could ensure their protection from legal consequences. The result was the creation of parallel power structures where criminal families wielded more practical authority than elected officials. The media sensationalism that surrounded cases like the French-Eversole feud created perverse incentives for continued violence. As newspapers discovered that stories of mountain warfare sold papers and attracted national attention, professional killers like Bad Tom Smith became celebrities of sorts, their exploits romanticized and mythologized in ways that encouraged others to follow their example. The economic rewards of media attention meant that families engaged in feuding conflicts had financial incentives to escalate their violence in ways that would attract journalistic coverage. This commercialization of Appalachian suffering created a feedback loop where violence generated publicity, publicity attracted outside investment in continued conflict, and continued conflict produced more violence. The technological advantages that professional killers brought to Appalachian feuding represented another significant departure from traditional mountain warfare. Where earlier conflicts had been fought with hunting rifles and shotguns, hired assassins like Smith introduced military-grade weapons and sophisticated tactical approaches that gave their employers decisive advantages over traditional family militias. The French family's investment in superior firepower and professional military expertise demonstrated how outside capital could be used to overwhelm local resistance to industrial development. This technological disparity meant that families who attempted to maintain traditional approaches to conflict resolution found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by opponents who had access to modern military equipment and training. The geographic expansion of Appalachian violence that accompanied the rise of professional killers reflected the broader economic forces that were transforming the region during the late 19th century. Where traditional feuds had been confined to specific valleys or counties, the involvement of coal companies and other industrial interests meant that conflicts now spanned multiple states and involved participants from across the country. Bad Tom Smith's ability to move freely between different feuding territories and offer his services to the highest bidder demonstrated how professional violence had become a regional industry rather than a local phenomenon. This expansion of conflict zones meant that the destabilizing effects of feuding violence spread far beyond the communities where the original disputes had originated. The intergenerational trauma created by the industrialization of Appalachian violence would continue to affect mountain communities long after the original feuding families had disappeared or been destroyed. Children who grew up during the height of professional violence learned that survival required constant vigilance and that authority figures could not be trusted to provide protection. These lessons, passed down through families and communities, created lasting patterns of mistrust and self-reliance that would influence Appalachian responses to outside authority well into the modern era. The violent reaction of Hobart Ison to media intrusion in 1967 can be understood as a direct consequence of this intergenerational trauma, as mountain families continued to view outsiders as potential threats long after the economic conditions that had originally created such dangers had changed. The economic legacy of families like the Cornets, French, and Isons extends beyond their immediate involvement in feuding conflicts to encompass broader questions about resource extraction, community development, and the relationship between local autonomy and outside investment. The French family's role in facilitating coal company land acquisition established patterns of exploitation that would be repeated throughout the 20th century, as outside interests continued to extract wealth from Appalachian communities while providing minimal benefits to local residents. The violent resistance to this exploitation, whether through traditional feuding or the kind of desperate action taken by Hobart Ison, reflected deeper frustrations about economic powerlessness and cultural marginalization that persisted long after the feuding era had ended. The transformation of Appalachian violence from family-based honor conflicts to professional criminal enterprise ultimately represented a microcosm of the broader changes affecting American society during the Industrial Revolution. The same forces that created urban organized crime syndicates in cities like Chicago and New York also transformed mountain feuding from a traditional cultural practice into a modern criminal industry. Families like the Cornets, French, and Isons found themselves caught between competing systems of authority and morality, forced to adapt traditional practices to modern economic realities in ways that often corrupted both their cultural values and their community relationships. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of allowing economic desperation to override moral principles and the long-term consequences of choosing violence as a solution to complex social and economic problems. The ultimate lesson of these deadly Appalachian families lies not in their individual acts of violence, but in their collective demonstration of how quickly civilized society can break down when economic pressures overwhelm social institutions and cultural restraints. The Cornet family's evolution from pioneering settlers to feuding participants, the French family's transformation from merchants to employers of assassins, and the Ison family's violent response to media intrusion all illustrate how ordinary people can be driven to extraordinary violence when they perceive threats to their survival, honor, or way of life. As the dust settled on Bad Tom Smith's execution in 1895, the era of professional violence in Appalachian feuding began to evolve into something even more sinister. The hanging that drew 20,000 spectators marked not an end, but a transformation of family-based violence into organized criminal enterprises that would plague the region for decades to come. Smith's death confession had revealed the intricate web of corruption connecting feuding families to local officials, business leaders, and outside interests. But removing one hired killer did little to dismantle the system that had created him. The legacy of the Cornet, French, and Ison families extends far beyond their individual acts of violence to encompass a fundamental transformation of Appalachian society from a traditional mountain culture based on kinship and honor to a militarized landscape dominated by fear, corruption, and economic exploitation. These families represented different aspects of this transformation, each contributing to the breakdown of legitimate authority and the rise of violence as the primary means of resolving disputes and controlling resources. The systematic corruption that enabled families like the French to operate with impunity created a template for organized crime that would influence Appalachian society well into the 20th century. Benjamin French's use of hired killers and his network of corrupt officials established precedents that later coal companies and criminal organizations would follow when they sought to control territory and suppress opposition. The French-Eversole feud demonstrated how outside economic interest could weaponize local conflicts, using family loyalties and traditional honor codes to advance their own agenda while devastating the communities they claimed to serve. The militarization of Appalachian justice in response to feuding violence created its own set of problems, as the state's heavy-handed interventions often punished entire communities for the actions of a few violent families. The blanket court, established after Robin Cornet's murder, conducted under military protection in a tent, represented a complete breakdown of normal legal processes and the imposition of martial law on civilian populations. This militaristic approach to law enforcement would become a recurring theme in Appalachian history, as federal and state authorities repeatedly used overwhelming force to address problems that might have been better solved through community-based solutions. The economic foundations of Appalachian feuding created lasting patterns of exploitation and resistance that continue to influence the region today. The transition from a subsistence economy to industrial extraction, exemplified by Benjamin French's coal purchasing operations, established a colonial relationship between Appalachian communities and outside corporate interests that has persisted for over a century. Local families like the Cornets found themselves caught between traditional loyalties to their communities and the economic opportunities offered by collaboration with outside interests, creating internal conflicts that often erupted into violence. The cultural impact of these feuding families on Appalachian identity cannot be overstated. The media sensationalization of conflicts like the French-Eversole feud helped create lasting stereotypes about mountain people that have hindered economic development and social progress in the region. The transformation of local tragedies into national entertainment commodified Appalachian suffering while providing economic incentives for continued violence, as newspapers and magazines paid premium prices for dramatic stories of mountain warfare. The psychological trauma inflicted by feuding violence created intergenerational patterns of dysfunction that affected families and communities long after the original conflicts had ended. Children who grew up during the height of feuding learned that violence was an acceptable and often necessary response to conflict, passing these lessons on to their own children and creating cycles of violence that persisted well beyond the feuding era. The normalization of extreme violence during feuding created a cultural context where murder, ambush, and revenge were seen as legitimate responses to perceived wrongs. The breakdown of traditional mountain culture under the pressure of feuding violence and outside exploitation created a vacuum that was filled by various forms of organized crime and corruption. The skills and networks developed during feuding proved easily adaptable to bootlegging during Prohibition, and later to drug trafficking and other criminal enterprises. The mountain families, who had learned to operate outside the law during feuding, found it natural to continue these practices when new opportunities for illegal profit emerged. The environmental impact of feuding violence extended beyond human casualties to encompass the destruction of community institutions and social networks that had sustained mountain people for generations. Churches, schools, and local governments all suffered during periods of intense feuding, as violence made normal social activities dangerous and drove away teachers, ministers, and other community leaders. The atomization of mountain society during feuding created lasting social problems that continue to affect the region today. The role of women in Appalachian feuding, while often overlooked in traditional accounts, was crucial to understanding how family-based violence functioned and perpetuated itself. Women like those in the Cornet family often served as keepers of family honor, encouraging male relatives to seek revenge and maintaining the oral traditions that kept grievances alive across generations. The targeting of women and children during feuding represented a breakdown of traditional codes of conduct that had previously limited the scope of mountain violence. The relationship between feuding violence and religious belief in Appalachian communities created complex moral and theological questions that influenced mountain Christianity for generations. The apparent contradiction between Christian teachings about forgiveness and the demands of family honor created spiritual crises for many mountain people, leading to the development of distinctive forms of Appalachian Christianity that attempted to reconcile these competing value systems. The political consequences of Appalachian feuding extended far beyond the mountain regions to influence state and national policies toward rural America. The perception of Appalachian communities as lawless and violent justified federal interventions that might not have been acceptable in other regions, establishing precedents for government action that would later be used to justify similar interventions in other rural areas experiencing social problems. The technological changes that occurred during the feuding era, particularly improvements in firearms and transportation, fundamentally altered the nature of mountain violence and made traditional forms of conflict resolution increasingly deadly. The availability of repeating rifles and improved ammunition transformed family disputes that might once have been settled with fistfights or single combat into massacres that claimed dozens of lives. The construction of railroads and improved roads brought outside influences and weapons into previously isolated communities, while also providing escape routes for criminals seeking to avoid justice. The legal innovations developed in response to Appalachian feuding, including special courts, military tribunals, and extradition proceedings, established precedents that influenced American jurisprudence for decades to come. The interstate nature of many feuds forced courts to develop new procedures for dealing with crimes that crossed state boundaries, while the involvement of state militias in law enforcement created constitutional questions about the proper role of military forces in civilian law enforcement. The economic costs of Appalachian feuding extended far beyond the immediate expenses of military intervention and law enforcement to encompass broader impacts on regional development and investment. The reputation for violence that surrounded feuding counties made them unattractive to legitimate businesses and investors, perpetuating cycles of poverty and underdevelopment that made communities more vulnerable to exploitation by criminal enterprises and outside interests seeking to extract resources at minimal cost. The educational consequences of feuding violence were particularly devastating for Appalachian communities, as schools became targets of violence and teachers fled the region during periods of intense conflict. The disruption of education during the feuding era created generational gaps in literacy and knowledge that hindered economic development and social progress for decades afterward. The association of education with outside interference also created lasting suspicions of formal schooling that affected Appalachian attitudes toward education well into the modern era. The public health impacts of feuding violence extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass broader effects on community health and medical care. The targeting of doctors and other medical professionals during feuds disrupted healthcare delivery in already underserved regions, while the stress and trauma of living in violent communities created lasting mental health problems that were poorly understood and inadequately treated at the time. As we conclude this examination of the Cornet, French, and Ison families and their roles in Appalachian violence, it becomes clear that their legacy extends far beyond the specific crimes and conflicts in which they were involved. These families represented different aspects of a broader transformation of American society during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as traditional communities struggled to adapt to industrialization, urbanization, and the expansion of federal authority. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the consequences of allowing economic exploitation, political corruption, and social inequality to fester, unchecked in isolated communities. The violence perpetrated by these families was not simply the result of individual pathology or cultural backwardness, but rather the predictable outcome of systemic failures that created conditions where violence became a rational response to impossible circumstances. The breakdown of legitimate authority, the exploitation of natural resources by outside interests, and the abandonment of rural communities by state and federal governments created a perfect storm of conditions that made violent conflict almost inevitable. Understanding the legacy of these deadly Appalachian families requires recognizing that their violence was both a symptom of broader social problems and a contributing factor to the perpetuation of those problems. The cycles of violence, poverty, and exploitation that characterized the feuding era created lasting patterns that continue to influence Appalachian communities today, demonstrating the long-term consequences of allowing social problems to escalate into violent conflict. The stories of the Cornet, French, and Ison families ultimately serve as reminders of the importance of maintaining strong institutions, promoting economic justice, and addressing social problems before they escalate into violence. Their deadly legacy stands as a testament to the human costs of neglecting rural communities and allowing powerful interests to exploit vulnerable populations without accountability. As we face contemporary challenges in rural America, the lessons learned from these Appalachian families remain as relevant today as they were over a century ago, reminding us of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting communities from the forces that once turned the mountains of eastern Kentucky into battlegrounds of family based violence and terror.